Hello and welcome to History Extra podcast from BBC History Magazine, Britain's best-selling history magazine. I'm Ellie Cawthorne. On today's podcast, we have an interview about Second World War strategy making with historian Simon Parkin. Simon's new book, A Game of Birds and Wolves, The Secret Game That Won the War, tells a remarkable story of how a group of young women used board gaming techniques to alter the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. BBC World History's editor, Matt Elton, spoke to Simon at our History Weekend in Winchester this November, where he was giving a talk, to find out more.
So people often think of board games and games more generally as quite a childish thing. But your new book is about the way in which games were used in the Second World War. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So war games are a tool that have been used for really the last 400 years by professional militaries, governments and politicians, civil servants. And the idea of a war game is really to, I suppose, if you're a foot soldier, the way that you practice war is you go and you run around in the field and pretend that your opponent is on the other side. Now, if you're a strategist or a tactician, you can't really do that. You have to find another arena in which to get your practice in. And war games are really the most efficient way in which to do that. Essentially, I found this story when I was talking to the British Army about the sort of war games that they run now and finding out the ways in which they have proven useful over the years. And there's a war game analyst called Major Tom Muat, who works at the Defence Academy in Shrivenham, and he designs war games that help the British government. For example, he designed one that's simulated what would happen when President Trump came to visit London, and the idea is that various, the heads of police and sit around and they go through the way in which the British public might react to that and the things that they might not have anticipated had they not played that through. And I said to him, have you got an example of where something learned in a war game has proven really useful in the real world? And he gave me the example of Operation Raspberry, which is a story from the Second World War that's not very well known, about a group that was based in Liverpool that essentially used a board game to revolutionise British anti-U-boat tactics.
And was this something that was already well established at the start of the Second World War, or was it quite a new thing to do in this conflict?
It was new to the Second World War, so war games had been used by the Navy prior to that, and there had been war games in anticipation of the Second World War. Some run in the late 1930s to envision, what tactics the Germans might use at sea. But certainly, this was the formation of WATU in the first week of 1942 was the first time that war games had been officially used to examine the U-boat problem and essentially figure out why the U-boats were being so successful in taking down our merchant ships in an effort really to starve Britain by stopping the food and fuel supplies reaching us.
You mentioned WATU there. What do we mean when we say that? And who were the key people responsible for setting up this, I suppose, slightly unlikely thing?
So WATU is the acronym for the Western Approaches Tactical Unit. This was the unit that was set up by Gilbert Roberts, who was a 41-year-old, retired, in fact, naval commander. He had, in 1937, been invalided, to use the rather cruel term of the time, out of the Navy after he contracted tuberculosis. And in fact, he thought he might die, but he didn't. He survived. And then for a few years, worked hard to try and fight his way back into the Navy, but they couldn't really find a job for him. And then almost out of the blue, he gets this call in the last week of 1941 saying, come to the Admiralty, which is the Navy's headquarters in London, bring an overnight bag. He turns up, and when he arrives, he's let into a secret, which is really something that very few people at the time knew, which was the true extent of merchant shipping losses that we'd undergone. So the U-boats, or the German Naval Command, had figured out that if they could sink the ships coming over the Atlantic, bringing the vast amount of food that we require to survive. If they could cease that inflow, then it would be a very efficient way to bring the war to a close, because we would be unable to continue the war. Churchill had sort of downplayed the statistics here with the British public, and he'd overplayed the number of U-boats that we've been sinking, presumably to sort of maintain morale or something. So anyway, when Roberts is brought into the Admiralty and told the true situation and how close we actually were to starvation, he's astonished. And what they say to him is, because you've been a very efficient tactician in the past, for a couple of years, Roberts ran war games prior to the war in Portsmouth as a training, a method. They said, we want you to go to Liverpool and set up this group, the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, or WATU, and figure out what is this tactic that the U-boats are using that has been evading us, that's been leading to this huge loss of shipping and life. We need you to figure it out. We don't care how you do it. We know you're good at games. Maybe that will be it. And they sort of send him off on the midnight train.
And was he just left to his own devices?
Pretty much. So he arrives in Liverpool and he meets with Sir Percy Noble, who was the Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, who ran Derby House. Noble is very dismissive of Roberts when he arrives. He sort of says, well, you can have the top floor of the building, but, don't bother me with it. I'm not, there's a war going on. Whatever you're doing is, do what you need to do. So sort of Roberts is, I guess, a little bit dispirited from that. So he takes over the top floor of Derby House and he's assigned 10 wrens, that's young women of the Women's Royal Naval Service, and 4 of whom are wren officers who have been handpicked because of their aptitude in mathematics and statistics, and then 6 wrens ratings. And that is essentially the WATU team, Roberts and these 10 young women. And they get to work basically adapting a war game in order to restage the battles that are happening right now out in the Atlantic. And the way they do this is they get the after-action reports, they see exactly blow by blow what happened in this battle, and then they recreate it in the game on the floor. It's sort of a bit like a gymnasium, with lines painted on it, a bit like a chessboard. Each line is spaced apart to, I think, represent a distance of 10 nautical miles. And they recreate the battles, the position of the ships, the position of the U-boats as they were suspected. And from that, they sort of, from this crow's nest perspective, can see what went wrong in the battles and try and figure out where the positions of the U-boats, and from there maybe try and expose this tactic that's been evading us.
And what sort of sight would have greeted someone if they'd walked into this room to see all this happening?
Mm-hmm. So I guess a cross between a gymnasium and a children's nursery. So it's a large linoleum floor, a bit like a gymnasium. And then, yes, like I say, these lines painted on it to represent the ocean, and then chalk markings. So the manoeuvres of the naval ships were drawn in white chalk, and the manoeuvres of the U-boats were drawn in green chalk. And then around the boundary of the game, there were canvas sheets, a bit like voting booths, with sort of eye slits on them. And this is where the players were divided into 2 teams, one team playing as the U-boats, the others playing as the Royal Naval Escorts. If you were on the team of the Royal Naval Escorts, you stood behind this canvas and you looked through the peephole, which was designed to replicate the visibility that we have, on the bridge of a ship, about 5 miles. Turns were taken in sort of 2-minute intervals to give the pressure of playing of what a real sea battle is like. And so a rather curious scene, I think.
And what sort of people came to play this game, and what did they make of it, I suppose?
Well, initially, Roberts' goal was to expose this tactic that had been evading us. And essentially this cardinal misunderstanding was, we had believed that U-boats were attacking merchant ships from outside the perimeter of a convoy. So merchant ships would sort of travel along a bit like a flock of sheep, so tightly together. And we believe, and the naval escorts who were designed to protect them, a bit like sheepdogs protecting a flock of sheep, would sort of encircle them, looking out for trouble. Now, we had assumed that the U-boats would be firing their torpedoes from outside the perimeter. What it turned out, by restaging the game, Roberts figured out that, in fact, what must be happening is the U-boats must be making their way at night from the stern of the convoy, slinking in between through the escort shield and in between the columns of the convoy and firing almost from point blank range. Now, once they'd figured this out and developed an effective countermeasure, which they did, which was called Raspberry, and this was designed to flush out any U-boats that were sort of acting like a fox in among the hens. As soon as they'd done this, basically every Royal Naval captain was sent to Wattu to basically undergo a week-long training course where they would have the U-boat tactics exposed to them, where they would learn this countermeasure, Raspberry, and then the other operations that the team developed, which were often named after different fruit. And through this week-long course, they would then learn basically much more efficient anti-submarine warfare tactics.
I should ask, why was it called Raspberry in the first place?
The name Raspberry was given to this manoeuvre by Jean Laidlaw, who was a 21-year-old Wren officer who was assigned to Roberts. She was one of the few Wren officers who worked at Wattu throughout the entire war from 1942 to 45. She was the one who did all of the statistics when coming up with this, and so she was given the honour of naming it. And she said, I want to call it Raspberry because it's like blowing a raspberry at Hitler.
Which is an amazing name. What else do we know about the other women who were involved in this?
Initially, the other, so there was Jean Laidlaw, who was the first of the Wren officers. There was also Liz Drake, who was so short that she had to have a stool specially made for her so that she could see through the slits in the canvas sheets. There were a number of women who were involved. So there was also June Duncan was one of the ordinary Wrens who worked there. She, after the war, went on to become a very well-known catwalk model, appearing in well-to-do fashion magazines like Vogue and Vanity Fair and the likes of that. There was Janet O'Kell, who was a young Wren who worked her way up the ranks through the years. The most of the Wrens were picked because they had shown some aptitude for maths or statistical work, like I said, though.
So impressed you remember the names of these people. I would be terrible at that.
Still to come on the History Extra podcast.
I think that the role of Wattu, the role of the people working from Derby House, is equally important, is equally notable. At the end of the war, Sir Max Horton wrote a letter to Roberts and to the other Wrens saying that your work has contributed in no small measure to the final defeat of Germany.
Was there a point at which they had to present what they discovered to the rest of the organisation in some way, and what happened when that happened?
Yeah, so the night that Roberts and the Wrens had this sort of revelation that the U-boats must be attacking from within the columns of the convoy, they sort of worked into the night to develop their countermeasure. And then the next morning, Roberts wrote to Sir Percy Noble, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, who had been so sceptical to Roberts when he arrived in Liverpool. And he said, why don't you come up? We think we're onto something. Come up to Wattu's office and see what we've done. So the next day, Noble and his staff come up to Wattu's office, and there's sort of an air of snootiness, I think Roberts recorded in his diary. So very sceptical about what's going on. But then as they play through this one battle and Roberts starts to explain, he was a very good communicator, very, very talented in sort of bringing the battle to life. He starts to explain what he saw as the cardinal misunderstanding that we'd had and exposes the U-boat tactic as he saw it. And he describes Percy Noble sitting forward in his chair, his demeanour changing from one of scepticism to one of sort of excitement and respect. And afterwards, Noble stands to his feet and says, congratulations, and then asks, what's this going to be called, this manoeuvre? And that's when Laidlaw explains it's going to be a Raspberry. And almost immediately, the Raspberry manoeuvre was added to the set of instructions that was sent out to everyone who was sailing the Atlantic.
Did it make an immediate impact?
Had an immediate impact, yes. So the number of U-boats that were sunk in the summer of 1942 increased, and that caused an increased trend throughout the remainder of the year. In fact, all the way through to the summer of 1943, which is when the U-boats were decisively driven from the Atlantic following the Battle of ONS 5.
And did the fact it had had this impact change how people viewed the importance of this kind of wargaming to the outcome of the war?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think certainly at the time, Roberts and the Wren's work was highly esteemed. So he was awarded the CBE in January 1944. And I think because the U-boats had been driven from the Atlantic, the powers that be decided this is something we're going to talk about publicly. So there were a number of journalists who were allowed to go and write about Whitty. There was a fantastic article in Illustrated magazine with fantastic photographs and a full description of it all. And I think for a while Whitty's work was feted and people understood the significance. But after the war, I think there was an image established probably by books and movies of the public image of what heroism in the Second World War looked like was really sort of Spitfires cresting a hill, people escaping from prisoners of war camps, basically live action, and the sort of image of this remote tactical work, people kneeling on the floor, measuring things with bits of chalk and string probably didn't chime with that imagery. So for one reason or another, Whitty was sort of forgotten, faded from the popular historiography of the Second World War. And it's only really in recent years that it's been sort of rediscovered and people have become interested in it again.
How did you find out more information about what happened in this story?
Well, I was working on a radio documentary for The New Yorker about wargaming, contemporary wargaming, and it was during the course of making that programme that Major Tom Muat, who is a war game designer for the British Army, mentioned Raspberry. There was a book, a biography written about Captain Roberts in the 1970s, which people who know a lot about the Battle of the Atlantic, and the Battle of the Atlantic is, I would say, one of the less popular fronts that people are interested in the Second World War. So that was noted, and I think in history books there has been certainly mention of Roberts and Whitty, but this book is really, I would say, the first sort of book-length study of it. There's a group of wargamers at DSTL, which is a group of wargaming analysts and professionals, and they were the ones who sort of picked up on this. Paul Strong, who is a wargame analyst there, wrote an article about it, which I think is what made it, brought it to Major Tom Muat's attention, and then he passed it on to me.
So did Whitty go on coming up with new kind of techniques after they made this breakthrough?
Yes, so they didn't stop with raspberry, so there was also pineapple, artichoke, half raspberry. There were numerous tactics that were, initially raspberry was there for when a merchant ship went up in flames, it was what do we all do, the escort ships, what pattern do we move in, where do we drop our depth charges? So they then started developing countermeasures that were designed in anticipation of a U-boat attack as well as in the aftermath.
And they all proved successful to some extent, I'm guessing.
Yeah, well, yes, definitely so.
How would you like this operation to be remembered in the context of the war compared to, say, some other more famous things such as the Enigma machine? Do you think it's as important as those?
Well, I think it's very difficult to put your finger on one particular piece of the jigsaw that went into the success of the Allies in the Second World War. And Bletchley Park in recent years and Enigma has obviously been something that's been a focus on. I think that the role of Whitty, the role of the people working from Derby House is equally important, is equally notable. At the end of the war, Sir Max Horton, who was at the time Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, wrote a letter to Roberts and to the other Wrens saying that your work has contributed in no small measure to the final defeat of Germany. So this is, I would say, not sort of a contemporary overstatement of the importance of the role that Whitty played. Even contemporaneously, people acknowledged that Whitty's work was hugely important. And I think it's important for us now to acknowledge that and refocus on it and draw out details that perhaps might otherwise have been lost to history.
Is there anything that we still don't know? If you could travel back and ask someone a question, what might you ask?
One of the difficulties in writing the book is finding first-hand accounts from the women who were involved. So I think after the war, if you were a fairly senior naval officer, it was not too difficult for you to get special dispensation to be able to write your memoirs, to tell everyone about the amazing things you did in the war. And lots of men got to do that. If you were a sort of 23-year-old young woman who had worked at Whitty for 3 or 4 years, that was a secret you were going to have to keep for 50 years. And most of them did. And one of the Wrens who was involved was still alive when I started work on the book, and I got to talk to her and her family. But I think a lot of the other Wrens either did not write down their stories, or in the case of Jean Laidlaw, she did write down her story, and then her family, when she died, just one reason or another, it got lost in her possessions, and so her story never got to be told. So that is one thing I would like to go back and be able to interview each of them.
Yeah. Was this technique copied elsewhere by the Allies in the war or later?
Yes, so Whitty inspired a number of satellite units across the empire in various far-flung places. Less is known about those operations, but I think we do know that there were at least 6 of them. The last remaining report in the National Archives is the annual report from 1944, which lists the numbers of people who had been through, the number of officers who had trained there, and it gives some details about these satellite units as well. So we know that, it was certainly influential in that regard.
Finally, your own story is being adapted for a film, I believe. What's that like?
It's strange. So the book has been optioned, and what that means is that a film production company has said, we would like to have dibs on this for 18 months. And during that time, we will decide whether we actually want to pay the whatever money it takes to make a movie to actually develop this. So still very much at the first hurdle. Hopefully it goes further. We'll see. It is strange. I mean, I'm a writer. That's my passion. So I would like there to be a film, because hopefully it will encourage people to read the book.
That was Simon Parkin. Simon's book, A Game of Birds and Wolves, The Secret Game That Won the War, is available now, published by Sceptre. Simon's also written a feature about this story in issue 20 of BBC World Histories magazine, which goes on sale on the 2nd of January 2020. If you'd like to join us at our next events, we've got 2 days of talks on medieval life and death coming up in London and York in March and May 2020. You can find out more about that at historyextra.com/events. Thanks for listening. Today's podcast was produced by Ben Hewitt and Jack Bateman. Join us again on Thursday when Sarah Cockerell will be speaking to Dan Jones about Eleanor of Aquitaine.